The woman had just returned home when she sensed something was wrong. Her children were sitting by the window, completely motionless, their eyes unmoving. When she finally understood what she saw, her legs gave way and she collapsed to the ground. The children's bodies were gone. Only their heads remained on the windowsill. The film opens far from the city, on a remote mountain. A woman named Capra lived with her 3 children. Life there was simple. The 2 older boys, Mike and Micho, loved to play and often got into trouble, while the youngest, Mary, was quiet, obedient, and much older than his age. They lived peacefully for a long time, but one unintentional mistake changed everything. The older boys accidentally set fire to the grain storehouse. Capra tried her best to save what she could, but the fire consumed all their food supplies. Even after this disaster, Mike and Micho showed little remorse and continued to harass Mary. Capra yelled at them harshly, and finally, they lowered their voices. Despite their eclipse, she kept her pain to herself and sent them to sleep, trying to maintain the family's unity. One day, the children went up to the mountain to play, but Capra stayed home to cook. At that moment, an unwelcome visitor arrived. He was a man named Lubel, a hunter from the mountain and the children's godfather. He had been a friend of Cabra's deceased husband, and since she became a widow, his visits had become more frequent, his intentions never pure. Cabra knew exactly what he wanted and always refused him. All she cared about was raising her children in peace, but Lubel wouldn't accept rejection. He claimed he would never harm the children, but he sensed that loneliness could drive a man mad. Before leaving, he warned her that they would meet again soon. This time, he even tried to force his way into her house. Enraged, Cabra blurted out something rash. She wouldn't consider being with him unless her children disappeared. It was a sentence spoken in a moment of anger, but that sentence... She would soon be chasing her at dinner that night. Capra said that since the warehouse had burned down, she would need to go down to the city the next day to buy food. She told the children to stay inside and guard the house well, promising that she would return before nightfall. Then, as the children were getting ready for bed, Capra stayed under the dim light of the lamp, working on the wool she wished she could trade for the boys' requests. The boy, who still couldn't sleep, begged her to tell him a bedtime story, so she began to tell them the well-known tale of the goat and her 3 kids, a story about a mother goat struggling to protect her young children from a hungry wolf. What she didn't know was that Lupel was outside, listening to every word. This was the story of the goat and her 3 kids. In the middle of the night, Mary got up to go to the bathroom. Lupel quickly hid behind a wooden shed, watching silently. Mary didn't notice anything strange. The boy took his lantern and went back to his room and got into bed. He didn't feel that danger was now looming over their house. The next morning, early, before leaving for the city, Capra reminded her 3 children to lock the door with the key no matter what, unless they heard her voice clearly. The children agreed without hesitation. Then she drove off and began to disappear slowly into the heavy morning fog. Mary stood watching until she was completely gone, and then he carefully locked the bolt. But the promise didn't last long. As soon as their mother left, Mike and Micho started bothering Mary again. To escape them, Mary climbed onto the roof beams to create some distance between himself and his siblings. Suddenly, a strange sound came from outside the house. The children immediately stopped fighting and gathered at the window. Someone was whistling a tune, the exact same tune their mother had been singing before she left. The older siblings were convinced it was their mother, but Mary felt uneasy. He insisted they not open the door unless they heard her real voice, even reminding them that he saw eerie shadows on a mountain the day before. But Mike was taken in by his words and said that no one else would be outside humming that song. Annoyed by Mary's insistence, he pushed him away and unlocked the door. The moment the door opened, they knew their mistake. It wasn't their mother standing outside. It was Lupel. At first, Mike moved to greet him, but he froze in his place when he saw Lupel reaching out to get a dagger. Terror gripped them. Mike tried to slam the door shut, but he was no match for the man. Lupel forced his way in, grabbed Mike from behind the door, and threw him to the ground without any effort. Mary, who quickly hid under the oven, watched in horror as her brother lay motionless. Every fiber of his being was telling him to scream, but fear kept him silent. As soon as Lupul entered the house, Mary crept quietly towards the door and then realized that Lupul had locked it from the outside. Any attempt to open it will make a sound. The faces in the bedroom of Lupul heard a faint sound and turned around. He was holding Capra's clothes and smelling their scent as he moved forward. His boot landed in a puddle. Misho was terrified and trembled under the sink. Lupul dragged his dagger across the floor and made a sharp, scratching sound that echoed throughout the room. Misho tried to retreat to the corner, but Lupul grabbed his leg at the heel. The blade sliced through his boot, and a scream of pain filled the house. A sudden noise came from the door. Someone was trying to open it. Lupul moved quickly, grabbed his dagger, cleaned it, and went to see what was going on. At first, he assumed Mary had escaped, but the creaking of the flimsy wooden floor told him the little boy was still inside. He started searching every corner. His eyes fell on the stove, and then he searched the entire room. There was no one under the table. The only place left for him to hide was the narrow chimney. He tried to reach inside, but the space was too cramped for his large body. He couldn't squeeze in, but he wasn't satisfied. He went outside, got an iron axe, and returned, humming the same familiar tune. Without hesitation, he began striking Misho, once after another time. The second time, the violence caused blood to splatter on the wall and even on the cross that hung there, hidden inside the chimney. Mary covered her ears and tried not to hear the sounds. She stayed there until everything calmed down and Lupul finally left, carrying the two bodies away. Only then did Mary go down to the house. It was a mess. Blood covered the floor, and the silence was heavier than anything he had ever known. The shock overwhelmed him, and he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Around sunset, Capra finally returned home, carrying her errands. But before she even reached the door, she froze. Something was definitely wrong. The sight before her made her trip, and she fell to the ground, screaming a scream of agony. Inside, Mary heard his mother's voice. He slowly dragged himself to the door and opened it. The moment Capra saw that Mary was still alive, she ran to him and hugged him tightly. Then, following the dark trail of blood on the floor, she reached for the scene she feared most. Fighting back tears, she asked to know what had happened. Mary, amid sobs, recounted everything. A strange whistle drew her brothers to the door, but they ignored his warning and opened it themselves. When Lupul forced his way in, Mike tried to hide behind the door, and Misho hid under the sink, but both were caught. Only Mary escaped because he squeezed himself into the chimney. When she heard the name of the man responsible for what had happened, any remaining strength Capra possessed crumbled. She had rejected him countless times, but she never imagined he would retaliate with something so horrific. Her hand trembled as she reached for something placed on the windowsill. The tragedy that had befallen her home shattered everything inside her, and the faith she had clung to vanished. She removed the cross from the wall and spent the entire night scrubbing away the blood. When she finally finished with the wall, she carried Mary to the bed and went back to cleaning. The earth, exhausted and terrified, finally gave way to Mary, who fell asleep. But his sleep was anything but peaceful. In the darkness of the night, he awoke suddenly to the sound of a stone striking the floor. The house creaked in the silence. He called for his mother, but another stone answered him. Just as he was about to get out of bed, he heard Lupul's unmistakable voice calling him, its echo so distinct it seemed to belong to another world. Mary woke up startled again, realizing it had been a nightmare. He immediately ran and hid in his mother's arms. From that day on, he couldn't even go to the bathroom alone. Capra would stand guard over him every time he returned, wrapping him in her old abaya and embracing him. The peaceful life they had known was gone. Every piece of clothing, every familiar thing, reminded her of the children she had lost. The grief slowly transformed into resentment and anger. Capra knew she couldn't confront Lupul with force, but he was stronger, bigger, and merciless. If she wanted justice, she had to be patient. She began preparing carefully, gathering some food. Those who were left, she started planning a big feast. The invitation was for the calamity. She had made this feast a trap. She gathered wood for the fire from the forest and worked all night, carving a leg from the legs of a wooden chair. It had to be precise. If it was thick, it would never break, and if it was thin, it would break very early. Every movement was steady and intentional. Her sadness made her focus stronger. Mary did not understand what she was doing. This was the same mother who always talked about faith and patience, and that we leave the reckoning to God. Now her appearance changed when he asked her what she was doing. She gave him nothing but a calm reply that sometimes a person has to rely on themselves, while she plunged a hot knife into the chair. Her anger was as clear as day. If he ever set foot in the house again, he wouldn't leave alive. After making sure Mary was in his bed, Capra went outside and started digging. She worked all night, driven by a rage that refused to let her rest. By the first light of dawn touching the mountain, the trap was ready. She carefully covered the hole with a clean rug and arranged the table with polished spoons and forks. She looked at the soup pot one last time. Everything had to look perfect before she left. Mary thought he should stay inside and listen to her. Then she wrapped her headscarf tightly and followed the faint trail of blood to the foot of the mountain. At first, the path was clear, but when she entered the forest, the fallen leaves and cracks in the ground swallowed the stains. For a moment, she thought she had lost her way. Then she heard crows. Their cries echoed from somewhere ahead. The crows were circling the place where there was death. Capra followed the sound, and after a while, she found what she was looking for there, near a simple campsite under the trees. The ground was gleaming with dark, dried blood. The sight filled her eyes with tears, but the grief strengthened her resolve. Lupul was asleep, leaning against a large tree, but he was startled by the sound of her footsteps. He looked up and saw her standing on a mountain slope. He quickly straightened himself and tried to appear calm. Capra approached quietly, hiding every trace of hatred and masking her quiet grief. She told him that she intended to hold a memorial feast for her children, and since he was their godfather, he had the right to attend. Lupul agreed without hesitation. He showed no guilt. All he displayed was a cold confidence that made the blood freeze in her veins. Capra didn't stay long. She turned and went back to her house, knowing that the same thing would happen to her later. Mary was about to fall asleep, sitting by the window, when suddenly he saw Lupul outside. Fear gripped his chest, but then he heard his mother's voice at the door. Her voice was steady. Hadi carefully opened the door. Lupul entered, glancing around the room. The table was beautifully set, the food generously presented. Everything was perfect except for one detail. There were no other guests. Capra took the chair and explained simply that the others were on their way. Amidst the food and drink, Lupul relaxed. She poured him more and more coffee, watching him cautiously. Suddenly, he leaned back in a chair. His weak legs moved slightly, but didn't break. Capra felt a pang of anxiety. The trap had to be set at the right moment. Lupul continued eating and drinking, looking at her with increasing boldness. Finally, Lupul succumbed to his instincts and grabbed Capra. She stood up with all her might, and as they struggled, the chair's weak leg moved slightly beneath him. He tightened his grip on her and refused to let go. Then, Mary's voice came from behind them. He emerged from the kitchen, holding a ladle with trembling hands. The sight of the boy silenced Lupul for a moment. It was enough that Capra had slipped from his grasp. Mary stood frozen, terrified, especially when Lupul's attention shifted entirely to him. The question was, where had he been hiding? What lay behind him? The meaning of fear was profound. Mary's tongue was completely tied. Lupul moved toward the boy, ready to grab him. Capra ran forward and pulled Mary back into her embrace. In that instant of movement and pulling, something shifted beneath Lupul's weight. A cracking sound was heard in the room. The weak leg of the chair finally snapped. Lupul reached out desperately to support himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. The rug beneath him collapsed, and he fell into the hidden hole beneath the floor. There was a cavity filled with dirt containing oil and dry wool strands, ready to ignite quickly. For a second, there was only astonishing silence. Then Capra lit a match. In an instant, the flames swirled around Lupul, his clothes catching fire, and the blaze intensified. His screams filled the house. Mary clung to his mother, trembling, but Capra didn't let go. Every time the corpse tried to scratch its way up, she would forcefully pull it back down. Years of suppression, grief, and resentment all came out of her. She screamed as the fire grew louder, cursing him for everything he had done to her children. But she didn't let him die quickly. She threw straw over the pit, controlling the fire so he wouldn't burn and be finished in a second. The fire scorched him, leaving his body slashed and disfigured, and his screams grew weak as he begged for mercy. Capra stood there, tears streaming down her face, wondering if her children had felt the same terror and helplessness in their final moments. Finally, she picked up a heavy stone from the ground and, without hesitation, threw it into the pit. This time, there was no movement or sound. Loba was finally dead. The moral of the story is that sometimes a single thoughtless sentence, a single warning ignored, or a single selfish desire could destroy an entire family. No matter how much you try to hide it, it will never bring back lost love. This is the end of the film, and we'll meet again in a new summary. Thanks for watching.